what are you seeing in terms of the CNY transactions on the SWIFT network today, outside of China?
Well, we have the possibility now to provide our members with insights into the transactions that are going over the SWIFT network, from which they can use the metadata to see business analytics and see what is the CNY usage, for instance, both in terms of number of transactions and in terms of value of those transactions across different market areas. And actually what we see is that the CNY is not only, or the renminbi, is not only used towards China and from China, but also outside of China. So actually CNY is being used in transactions in countries that do not involve China as one leg of the transaction. And that, I think, is a testimony to the internationalization of the CNY, because it's actually used not only outside of China, but outside of two countries that do not involve directly China.
Is there any way to drill down on that those transactions to figure out if there is a Chinese element in there, in that the parties have, it's part of a value chain where there are Chinese components in the transaction?
Absolutely. So it could be to support a trade that involves a Chinese importer, but where actually the trade is settled through Singapore. So we see transactions between Europe and Singapore in CNY, possibly to support a transaction that did involve a trade relationship of an importer-exporter in China.
And how fast has that been growing for you? I mean, what have you seen in terms of the growth in that volume?
Recently, we've seen a tremendous growth in the usage of the CNY. Overall, if you like, it's still, between brackets, currency number 24 to 29 within the worldwide scope. So the US dollar and the euro are still the major currencies. So the RMB still has some way to go to become currency number 2 or 3. But that will happen, I think, over time. More importantly, what we are looking at is the growth rate and the contribution to growth in terms of transactions. And there we see recent months a month-on-month growth of the renminbi of 30%, month-on-month. So that's a tremendous growth.
And do you see any activity on the intra-regional trade in the Asia-Pacific region at least?
That's another area that we're looking at very specifically. We don't have all the answers yet, but we're looking now specifically of the usage of the renminbi between China and its main counterparts in Asia, and to relate the volumes of trade to the volumes of CNY currencies. What we've already seen, for instance, is that Australia, a very big trading partner for China, although the CNY is underutilized in number of transactions. The second market area is where importers in China have a benefit to use the CNY in their transactions with Brazil. But again, although Brazil is a big exporter into China, the number of settlements that are in CNY are actually not in relation to the volume of exports from Brazil into China. So I think those are business opportunities for banks to actually take their RMB services into Australia and into Brazil. And I think recently we've seen overtures by the Chamber of Commerce and the government of Australia to actually pitch Australia as a trading partner for RMB settlement into China and into Shanghai.
Well, all of what you've just said are very, very interesting, because if we drill down, we would want to know who the counterparties are, whether there's a back-to-back arrangement, and so on. A lot also depends on the success of the renminbi. Do you think that the Chinese renminbi could be internationalized further if there wasn't this upward, pressure on the renminbi being revalued, to be revalued upwards in that sense?
Actually, I think the contrary. I think there's a lot of liquidity out there in renminbi.
But the liquidity,
for instance, trying to chase the few bonds that are issued.
Yeah.
So from the bond issuance point of view, they can keep the interest very low and the remuneration very low, because there's so big demand into the few bonds that are being issued. Because of people are expecting an appreciation of the CNY in the near term.
Right. Bond issuance and acceptance is perhaps one element. But for the most cases, bonds are treated as a deposit, basically. And what most of the investors in Chinese renminbi are doing are just sitting on their investment. So if there's no liquidity required, I think the take-up initially at least is very good. But you don't see a secondary market. You don't see greater liquidity as a result. So it's really like hurry up and wait. That seems to be the current sentiment in the marketplace. But the infrastructure is being played or being built for a greater volatility in the marketplace.
Exactly, and that volatility is something else that we see on the SWIFT traffic. Because at the end of the day, the SWIFT traffic is a reflection of the real economy. We've seen that with the financial crisis, the SWIFT traffic actually follows the development of the GDP. So what do we see recently with, you're referring to the volatility and the investments in the CNY, we actually see that one of the most active markets is the FX market. We see a lot of banks and countries using the CNY for trade, for payments, and really sticking out is the activity in the FX market. Almost 80 countries, almost 700 banks are involved in trading of CNY in FX. When you look, on the other hand, in the securities market, much smaller activity. So, indeed, the volatility is creating a lot of activity in the FX market.
And when you say a lot of activity, is that relative to the traditional currencies, relative to other emerging currencies, something to be excited about?
Something to be excited about still in relative terms. If you look at the contribution or the usage of the CNY in global FX terms, it is still in the order of 0.2 or 0.15%. So the CNY is not a major player yet as a currency. Also, an interesting way to look at that is what is the share of a country's GDP versus the volume traded in that currency. If you look at the US dollar, the GDP contribution is maybe 25% of America to the world. But the share of the US dollar in FX trading is more like 40%. Whereas if you look at China, contribution of China in GDP is 10%. But if you look at the FX value of the CNY, as I said, it's 0.1, 0.2%. So it's a complete mismatch. The trading in RMB is totally underrepresented when you look at actually the economic weight that China has in the world.
And that's cause for being positive, for expecting that it will go up substantially and very quickly. Because the question I had was, would the Chinese renminbi be more successful if it was not as much in demand as it is, by investors today because of its upside potential? It's a victim of its own success in that sense.
It's a victim maybe of its own success, and I think as long as the Chinese economy is riding on I would say on a boom, because the importance of the currency follows very much the growing importance of the economic status of the country.
Did you get to see the development of Japanese yen in its own time in the 1990s? Are there parallels that we can learn from?
I've read some academic studies about the comparison to the Japanese yen. Unfortunately, we cannot go back so much in time on the SWIFT traffic to draw any material conclusion as to how that's evolved over time from the SWIFT point of view. But I have seen comparisons as to where the Japanese yen or the Japanese government got it right and where to some extent they got it wrong. For instance, opening up the capital accounts in Japan too late. So there are some lessons maybe that from the Chinese opening up the renminbi could learn from the experience that Japan had with the yen.
Thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Thank you.